Thank you, everyone. I know you all know that I speak a lot on radio and TV. Sometimes I never shut up, and I do it for a living, but this is unbelievably hard because it's not something I do very often. I think it's my fourth time to talk about it. And every time I do, I'm very conscious of the fact that I shouldn't really go back there in my head. I think the more often we say things, even in the aftermath of grief, the easier it is to say them. So I'm going to do my best, and I hope you learn something from it. I'm often asked what I would write to my younger self. In reality, I always make a joke and say, never get that perm, and above all else, don't let anyone photograph you with that perm. But the reality is, get out now. Those three words, that's what I would have said to my younger self. It's only in the last year, while I've met other fellow survivors of domestic abuse, that I see my story reflected in theirs. But for so long, I didn't want to be one of them. I didn't want to admit that those things had happened to me over 9 years of a marriage. I buried them quite deeply. So often the victims of domestic violence have to remain silent, so their stories are misunderstood. The complex paradox of loving and living where the balance of control tilts. That uniquely human need to love and to feel loved intertwined tightly with jealousy and rage and control. Which is why bystanders, good friends sometimes, often ask those three words that you've heard so often today. Why did you stay? I've come to detest that question and how it makes me feel. Because really, if I piled everything that I now know onto a Petri dish and looked at it under a microscope, what I really want to know is, how did I leave? If I can answer that question, I feel I could help other people. I've spent the last 18 months talking to as many abuse survivors as I can, reading as many testimonies of abuse survivors, looking at every piece of research I could find in order to come up with what I think is the answer to why I stayed and also why I left. You may look at me like a dragon, a businesswoman and a broadcaster, and a lot of people say, you're not a typical domestic abuse survivor. Actually, I am. There's nothing special about me. Domestic abuse can happen to anybody. There are no boundaries. But also, I actually fit the profile. I was in my 20s. It was my first relationship. I was away from home, living in London. And furthermore, I was a nurse. I was hardwired towards empathy. When I spoke for the first time about living with domestic violence on the Late Late Show, I found it very hard to speak most of the time because I could remember the first time, the shock and the numbness. I remember the time when I knew I had to get out of the relationship, and I remember the last one, which was a final jolt that set me over the edge. The rest was a bit of a blur of bruises and humiliation and tears, and as I said, melded together in 9 years, buried so deep, I'd begun to convince myself it had happened to another woman very far away from me. This much I know from a lens of life experience about the anatomy of an abuse survivor. I divide them into 4 phases. They were the 4 phases that I share with many other survivors, not all, but some. The first one, I call it the seduction, the golden handcuffs phase. I met Peter when I was 20, 21. He was 40. He was very sophisticated. We met in a wine bar in London. On the 3rd date, I was gauche. We were in a fancy restaurant, a place that I'd never been in before in my life. And I was trying to think of something to say. In my silly, stupid little 21-year-old way, I said, you know what? The last boyfriend I had was also called Peter. And he slammed his glass down. He was extremely angry, unreasonably so, grabbed my hand. I can't remember his exact words, but they were along the lines of, you're my woman now. This is not a plaything. This is serious. Nobody else goes out with my woman when I'm going out with her. And I got up and went to the bathroom, and my gut was telling me, get out of here quick. That was the oddest thing. You'd swear you were having an affair behind his back on the 3rd date. So I came back to the table, just desperately trying to find a way of saying, cheerio, I'm off home now. And he immediately stood up and said, I'm so sorry, I'm so embarrassed. That'll never happen again. I've had a really stressful day. I'm completely mad about you. I'm crazy in love with you. And as I went to pick up my serviette, a gold bracelet fell out. Now, it's not that I was a material person. I didn't possess gold ever in my life. I went to a Dutch school. It was the fact that somebody I barely knew was bestowing such an enormous gift on me. He leaned over, put it on my wrist, and told me how much he loved me. And when I went home that night, I began to feel I was falling in love too. All the earlier intuition and unease I felt about the relationship was gone, and I was now absolutely thrilled that I'd met the man of my dreams. I was seduced by a charming man who flattered me with compliments and gifts, claimed to love me very early in the relationship. Many abuse survivors say the same. I was geographically isolated from family and friends. I was being replaced by his circle of friends, and nobody understood me more than he did. There was no one close enough to tell them that this was happening to me, and after all, I felt that would be the ultimate betrayal of my beautiful and wonderful marriage. This was the seduction phase. The delusion phase, the second phase, is far more complex. A lot of women never emerge from them. Some emerge really quickly. It took me a long time, the guts of 9 years. After that intense and life-changing dinner, we began to date regularly, always to very sophisticated places. Ryan Tubridy said to me, "You were a bit of an Eliza Doolittle," and maybe I was. I was very unsophisticated, he was very sophisticated. He was teaching me all about wines and eating well and using the right cutlery and how to dress and how I should look. But I was also on another learning curve, how not to irritate, how not to incite an act of rage or a forced shove or a push or a clenched fist. We were in a restaurant one night. The day afterwards, we were going on a long-awaited trip around the world. That's right, 6-8 months into the relationship, he was taking me around the world. I mean, what other man, only the man that loved me dearly, would be taking me around the world? As usual, he had the passport, he had my flight tickets, he had all of the details. We were driving home, and I don't know what I said to him, but he slammed the brakes on the car in the driveway, and he came around the other side, and I thought he was about to open the door for me. Instead of that, he took my head and he slammed it against the top of the car. And he very casually walked up to the front door, opened it, went inside, and went up to bed. I went in and sat on the sofa, numb and shocked, wondering, how did that happen? How could he do that to me? What did I say to make him do that to me? And to my shame, all of those hours that I sat there, I was also wondering what makeup I should wear to try and hide the bruises that were coming out on the side of my face and my ear. The next day, I can't even describe to you how I did this. I got up like a robot, took my bag that was already packed by him, and I went to the airport and we checked in for a flight. Well camouflaged. About halfway over the Atlantic, he leaned over and put his hand across my ear, which was huge and swollen. The side of my face was purple and blue, and he started to cry. And he said, "I'm so sorry I did that. I can't believe I did it. The stress of work, the holiday, it'll never happen again." And you know what? I believed him. I believed it was an aberration, that it was a one-off, and that somebody who loved me would never do those things to me ever again. Turned out I was wrong. That second phase of delusion is so dangerous because the tenderness and love were the moments I really, really wanted. I was in a never-ending cycle of emotion. It could happen in the course of a day, a week, or sometimes an hour, where there would be tension, almost palpable, in the house or in the car. Then there would be the threat or the physical violence, and then there would be the tenderness. And I worked really, really hard to get to those tenderness moments. I saw myself as not somebody who was not in love with my husband, but somebody who was failing to give him all of the ingredients he should have to love me back. Then the third phase, happily, did occur for me, reawakening. This is the phase when reality dawns, but new obstacles come forward for me to face. I was constantly on edge. Apart from the constant anxiety and fear that I lived through daily, we went for lunch with friends, and he had drank a lot, and he wanted to drive home early. I didn't want to get in the car with him, so I said I would stay on for an hour or two. It was a summer's evening, it was dusk. I went home later on, and I didn't have keys to the house, so I knocked the door, and there was no answer. I knocked and knocked and knocked, probably for 20 minutes. I was ringing his phone, I was ringing the home phone, I was rapping on the window, and I will admit that I was knocking quite loudly by the time we got to 20 minutes. Well, he came out and he claimed afterwards he was half asleep, but in a fit of rage, he grabbed me by the hair and pulled me into the house, and he rained blows all over me. He broke 3 of my ribs that day, a bone in the side of my face, and while I was lying on the floor, he went to get a knife from the kitchen, and I thought I would die. And whatever Herculean effort got me off that floor into the sitting room. There was no locks. I used the sofa, chairs, everything to barricade myself in. Everything was calm, and I fell asleep. And I woke up to him standing over me with the knife. I tried to get up, and he pushed me down. He was on his knees crying. He said I couldn't believe he'd done that to me, that it would never happen again. That he was distraught and he was sorry. He would take me straight away to a doctor. I could hardly see, my eyes were so swollen. The next day the remorse continued. We went to a doctor who very unhelpfully came out and eyeballed him in the waiting room and made me anxious that he would intensify the violence when we got home. The tenderness and remorse and the gifts and the flowers, they continued for the next few days. I was due a follow-up appointment, and we went back to the doctor, and I was gingerly trying to get into the car. And he slammed his hand on the steering wheel and said, "Seriously? You're some drama queen. Are you really going to make me pay for this for the rest of my life? One small error of judgment. Seriously." Now you have to remember, by then there were multiple moments in my life. I knew then that I was going to leave him, but it took me some time to do so. The final phase was the act of leaving. It's not a moment. There's never any perfect storm. It happens gradually, and I tried many times. I would drive home from work on a Friday and promise that I would have left him by Monday morning. And over the weekend, through slaps, my clothes out the window, I would find myself crying on the way to work, knowing that I hadn't done what I promised I would do. Then one thing changed. I went home to Dublin without him, and I told my mother. It was the first time in my whole life I told somebody, and it was a real trigger for me to get out. I just knew that once I told my mother, and she understood the true horror of what I was living with, that I could never, ever stay with him. I knew it. I went back to London. Every day, I promised I would leave him. I still don't know why, but at 4 o'clock one Friday morning, I packed a small bag. By then, all of the barriers that I feared were, I had no home, I had no money. Somehow he owned the house, but I was paying all the bills. I was lonely, I didn't have friends. These were all barriers that I saw as huge, insurmountable obstacles to walking away from him. But I was no longer in love with him, I was scared of him. I woke him up at 4 a.m. and said, "I'm leaving you." I spoke a bit about the violence and how I couldn't continue, and he laughed and said, "You're joking, right?" And as I walked out the door, I could hear him snoring upstairs in the bedroom. I can say that when I drove away from the house that morning, I had nothing and nobody, and I drove to London Heathrow and I stayed in an Ibis, $39.99, the cheapest I could find. And I sat on the floor crying, fearful for the future, my life, and all around me there were people packing to go on holiday, children laughing, family, all together. My life was beginning again, but I wasn't sure what it was going to be like. So in the aftermath, far from him diminishing in my mind, in the immediate aftermath, he became an even bigger monster. I was so afraid I would go back to him because I didn't have finances or a home or friends. I used to see him out of the corner of my eye in shops in front of me. When I poked into a garage forecourt, I once dreamed I saw him. And even though I had no petrol, went back on the M1 and risked losing all of the petrol in the car. The AA came and rescued me rather than facing him. From then to now, I felt powerless and weak during those years. So there's big upside to being able to speak about it. It's a hidden superpower, something I didn't realize until I did go on to the Late Late Show, and that was the ability to help someone who might be going through what I went through. Being a survivor of abuse changed me, but it didn't destroy me. Like many other survivors, I went on to live a huge and successful life. I married a wonderful man called Richard Hannaford, no longer with me, and I have a beautiful son called Dara. You know that in my life I've bought and sold many companies. My avoidance strategy during those terrible personal years was to spend my time working hard. My traits of entrepreneurship came out of that dark period in my life. I was not a born entrepreneur. During my 20s, I was learning failure, risk, determination, resilience. Biggest risk of my life was driving away from that house. Self-confidence and courage took a little bit longer. It's left me with a lasting legacy of the need to call out bullies wherever I see them. Intolerable behavior, whether it's in the workplace or in my personal life. It's got me into hot water on more than one occasion. Recently, when I was doing likewise at a meeting, somebody said to me afterwards, "That's the dragon in you." I said, "That's not the dragon in me, that's the survivor in me."